Well, it is really good to be with you here today. And in the next hour or so, I will introduce to you some of the findings within two aspects, two strands of the research that we, Church Army's research unit, conducted between 2016 and 2018. The two strands are discipleship and maturity as church. And I'll share with you some findings from our survey work with 174 messy churches in the Church of England, that's Anglican. Those were begun between 2006 and 2014. I'll also share some findings from our regional focus group interviews with leaders of a number of different denominations. I also want to share with you some images and quotes from the children and adults who took part in the research that we did with attenders, to remind us that, of course, behind every statistic there are people. In our attenders research, we asked participants to create a piece of art to express something of the way Messy Church was helping them in discipleship as a way into interview. So I'll intersperse these images and these key quotes between the sections of my presentation and allow a little silent reflection time. I'll also stop at a few points and give you a time to chat to your neighbours about the material I'm sharing with you. So here's the first image. A de-churched lady in her 60s, so someone who had grown up in church but had fallen away. This lady has been drawn back into church life after many years through Messy Church. She created this clay sculpture and told us, the pathways are all in different directions, and it doesn't matter where they start or where they end. And they can even swap over, so that we're all following a path, but we're all understanding in different ways. So the first of the two main strands, discipleship. Defining discipleship. It's not easy. Well, it is and it isn't. I think on the one hand, we instinctively or intuitively know what it's about. But on the other hand, how do you measure discipleship? Especially when, like the clay sculpture just now, it looks slightly different for each individual. The way we chose to define it was with a set of 5 dynamics as we've laid out in our Playfully Serious booklet. And they're here on the screen. You may well say, well, that's a bit broad, but we knew from our reading, from the literature review work that we did, that if we said it was about formal learning, someone would say, but surely it's about informal learning as well. And they'd be right. If we said it's about key moments of decision, people would say, yes, of course, but isn't it about a lifelong journey too? And they'd be right. If we said it's about head knowledge, others would say, but surely it's about your heart response as well. If we said, well, it's important that discipleship is owned individually, yes, but the most effective discipleship is owned in relationship, when you can be accountable to one another for how you're growing. And if we said it's about inner transformation, others would say, but it can't just stop there, it's got to be about outer transformation also. So at the same time as settling on these dynamics as a framework, we also listened carefully to our research participants, especially in the focus groups, to see if helpful ways were emerging for you. And we were aware Two, that sometimes a very tight definition imposed on you from above can feel like a straitjacket. The ways each of us choose to explain discipleship have to make sense to us and ring true to us personally as leaders in our local context. I'll say a bit more about that in a bit. So looking at some of the things we measured within those overall dynamics, what were the signs of hope around messy church and discipleship? What is working? Well, let me start with something on key moments of decision. Just by way of background, it isn't on the slide in front of you, but in our booklet and introduction video, we've quoted the statistic that leaders reported 61% of attenders were not already churchgoers when they started coming. New people come. Even if this is only your best guess as a leader, and what you as leaders don't know is that there are messy church families who travel around and attend as many as they can in any given month. This is still quite remarkable. And for us, across our British Isles, UK and Ireland, I can't think of anything else that is as effective in helping so many people step over the threshold into something advertised as church. Also, by way of background, let me give you some information about our statistics. We created a random stratified sample of two types of messy church. Those that see themselves as outreach initiatives and those that see themselves as fresh expressions of church. So that's why our statistical findings have overall percentages, all mess, but then we also have the FXC mess, fresh expressions of church, and outreach mess, outreach initiatives. And let me just give you a brief definition of both types. Outreach initiatives are those messy churches that operate more as events or activities, encouraging people who attend to come on to an existing church, an existing congregation in time. Fresh expressions of church are those messy churches through design, accident, resignation, realise that the majority of their tenders won't be able to make the cultural or social leap into an existing church congregation. So they are working to develop messy church as its own worshipping congregation. So, with all that background, looking at key moments of decision as one element of discipleship occurring, what's happening in our denomination anyway around baptisms and confirmations? Well, 14% of all messy churches in our sample reported that they'd held a baptism actually in a messy church gathering. And comments from our focus group interviews said how important it was for a first baptism to take place, as it led to more inquiries afterwards. It's almost as if people have to see it in order to be able to sort of envisage what could actually happen. And while some of you might wonder to what extent is this to do with background motivations of families getting children into church schools and having the forms signed by the vicar in our denomination anyway, look at the adult confirmation figure, especially the one reported in the fresh expression of church messy churches. 13%. I've ringed it in red. Modest, but encouraging. And at the same time, stories emerged in our focus group discussion about attenders engaging in confirmations and baptisms. Here's just one quote on the screen. A lady in her 60s had been looking for a church for 30 years, and she'd never found anything that she thought was real and authentic until she came to Messy Church and she asked about confirmation. what about informal learning? Informal learning as a dimension of discipleship. And forgive me, I'm dotting about a bit in these 5 dimensions. Well, these statistics in the table on the screen confirm what we probably suspected already. We often extend a come and join the team invitation to attenders who are keen to know more and experience more in Messy Church. Informal learning or non-formal learning is often likened to apprenticeship type learning, and it's this type of learning process that holds the most potential for change, innovation, new understandings compared with other types of learning. So Bob Hopkins states in his chapter in Messy Church Theology, there does appear to be something about Messy Church that helps people join the team. Summed up in the focus group quote on the screen, anyone can be a Messy Church leader. That can be a medium through which you grow into a better, deeper relationship with God. And talking of informality, we also asked leaders the question, how often were there informal spiritual conversations at your Messy churches? Leaders said this was quite hard to answer, but from what they had experienced and from what their wider team had fed back to them, this was their impression. 64% of Messy churches said occasionally, 21 said frequently. I wonder what you'd say about your Messy church. And then linked to this, under the dynamic of outer transformation, the Indigenous leadership figures in our sample were very encouraging. Those are the ones in the first column of the table. Especially in the more deprived areas, even in the areas in the highest deprivation rankings, 36% of Messy churches reported local people becoming part of the leadership team, as opposed to the overall 34%. Really quite remarkable. The percentage of Messy churches who reported at least one new believer or more, that's the second column, or sort of third column along, is one of those statistics that can lead to quite different reactions. Some might look at it and say, wow, praise God, new people are coming to faith in some of our Messy churches. But others might say, well, what does that say about the rest who didn't report new believers? And I'll leave you to decide. The language of new believers is probably used in some types of Anglican church and less so in others. So the language might have made people a bit cautious to tick yes if they thought this was about attenders praying a believer's prayer and giving their life to Jesus on the spot. I think all of us know the journey of coming to faith isn't a straightforward one. And as researchers, we use this term new believers in the broader sense. And I credit the leaders in our focus groups for their candour in comments such as the one on the screen. It waxes and wanes. None of our journeys are a trajectory, particularly when you're further back, working with people who know very little about the Christian faith. So that brings us on to the dynamic held in tension with key moments of decision. At the other end of that spectrum is the lifelong journey. And with a one-off piece of research, we weren't able to capture any statistical data to track longer journeys over time or longer stories of being a disciple. But what we did do was listen to your focus group comments that suggested that the language of journey did seem to resonate with you as leaders, your teams, and your attenders, the adults, the teenagers, and even the children on some level. Some of your comments included the quotes on the screen. We are used to sharing our stories and sharing things that have happened in our lives and modelling that for people who are just starting out on their journey with Jesus. We've been quite active in responding to refugees, that kind of social action. What can we do as a messy church as part of our faith journey? And a third comment not on the screen, just we talk about journeys a lot. We then took this listening into the design of our research work with attenders and used journey as the main definition, but touching on all of the other dynamics in passing. So as we say in our booklet, at its most simple, we describe discipleship as a journey of following Jesus throughout the whole of your life. And we, like you in the focus groups, found in our attenders research, this did seem to have meaning for attenders in a way that invited them into further reflection and discussion. And while we may not have longitudinal statistics, the responses in that attenders research confirm that for many of us, discipleship is a gradual process or a process of stages in our lives. But Messy Church is playing a key role in keeping attenders on that journey. Inner transformation, heart response by themselves. How can you measure these things directly? You can sometimes sense that something's happening in someone's heart, but it's hard to know what's really going on deep down inside someone. The closest we got to this was giving attenders a chance to reflect and listening to what they were saying about their inner journeys. So this adult attender told us, accessing church again, it kind of, blossomed into something that was still growing. But this sculpture ended up looking, I wanted a spiral effect, kind of the more, complex things that you don't see inside, as well as the kind of idea of flourishing, I guess, at the top. It's a beat deep, she told us. And it was this participant who shared with us their reflection that you see in the booklet. The way you explore faith in Messy Church deepens learning because it's so much more practical. That very aspect of making mistakes and drawing comparisons with your own life through stories. There is time for exploration and application. So, discipleship, what's working well? Time for you now to just have a word with your neighbour. I know you'll all be at different stages. Some of you have been working quite a long time at this issue of discipleship, some maybe just beginning to think about it. Just talk with your neighbour. What encouragements around discipleship do you see in your Messy Church or Messy Churches? We let our participants on our attenders research days choose their own research pseudonyms. So, Cat Ninja, aged 8, made these 2 clay sculptures and told us that walking with Jesus is a celebration, hence the present. And she said, I also made a cat, because she likes walking with Jesus too. So, this strand of discipleship, we've looked at what's working well, what's perhaps not working quite so well, what needs more work. Well, we think there is something around being more intentional about discipleship. And in terms of the discipleship dynamics, those 5 spectrums, it's something about discipleship being owned in relationship. We know that every person and their journey of faith is slightly different. And as our focus group interviews highlighted with the quote on the screen, you don't want to slip into churchy language that means precious little to those who come. But it's that attentiveness that expectancy born of intentionality, that being proactive about it as a group, that we could do more of, even if it's just a little bit at first. One leader commented in our focus groups, "Discipleship is not in our heads." And in the course of asking about discipleship methods in our telephone survey work, some leaders admitted that actually discipleship wasn't their intention, or they were expecting or hoping to see discipleship happen for attenders through the wider parish. And those percentages are on the screen. So I wonder, what would it look like if we were able to do discipleship a bit more intentionally together? What if, as a group of local leaders, you decided together how you felt comfortable describing discipleship and helped one another, supported one another in talking about this more to attenders? And then maybe debriefed as a team about it afterwards. In our survey work, we thought we detected a degree of fear around the word discipleship. Many leaders don't want to do the wrong thing, and yet it's well within the grasp of so many of us. In our focus group interviews, leaders did talk about some of the ways they watch out for discipleship in their messy churches as a group of leaders. Examples included attenders reaching out to support someone else in messy church, attenders lending a hand practically, attenders listening to you very carefully and asking thoughtful questions about what you're saying, wrestling with issues. And I wonder, do we create enough opportunities to invite questions, I wonder? Tricky questions. And if you're scared you won't know how to answer them, you could always invite someone else in, maybe a regional coordinator, or your minister, or a vicar, or someone else to answer the tricky questions. Or make sure you have them in advance so you can prepare your answer. And I know some of us are already wondering, what would it feel like to share a bit more about our own lives as examples of what discipleship looks like? Or tell stories of modern day disciples, maybe the well-known ones, as well as biblical characters. Would that help attenders get the hang of what we mean, I wonder? And just thinking back to the clay cat a moment ago, I know my first thought as a parent is, "Oh, that's nice, dear." But how much do we as leaders pay attention to what's going on for children? How they express and explore their spirituality as loving caregivers of animals and responsible caretakers of the natural environment. I don't know if any of you have come across the book The Spirit of the Child by Hay and Hunt. It's one of a number of sources that explores what spirituality in children looks like. Yet how many of us give time to thinking through and watching out for the signs of discipleship within children? I'm sure many of us do. Do we do it enough, and do we help our team do it too? So maybe one could say, how do we help each other have discipleship not only in our heads, but on the tips of our tongues? Another aspect of discipleship that needs more work was around the dynamic of, strangely, lifelong journey. So there are some big encouragements with lifelong journey, but there are also some challenges. What happens when people leave messy church? Most people dive straight in with the question, well, what are the follow-ons for children? And we asked our 174 survey respondents some questions around what provision has Messy Church established for parents and children once children reach some secondary school age, sort of junior high school age. And here on the screen are some figures for what Messy Churches are doing with their teens. So 28% reported a separate youth group, 21% reported teenagers serving as helpers, 8% further groups activities, 2% changed Messy Church to be youth-focused, and 1% told us that confirmation was their way to take teenagers forward. But there was another question about adults too. How many adults stayed involved when their children reached the stage of leaving? Perhaps unsurprisingly, those that did have adults staying on saw them join the team as helpers. But then some comments surfaced when we talked about this in the focus groups. One lady said, "It just hadn't occurred to me, the question of what happens to parents when their children move on. However much Messy Church is for the family, it really hadn't occurred to me." So I wonder what would happen if this thought did occur to us more regularly, without hounding or hassling people. If Messy Church is for families, how can we develop something for adults whose children are now too cool to want to hang out with us? How can we stay in contact with them, with those adults somehow? Do we start to do this with the value of creativity? Or the Messy Church value of hospitality, or celebration, or something else? I know this may be countercultural to the all-age value to work with parents of teenagers on their own, but we were struck by how many parents express their own spirituality in relation to their children, and I don't think this will evaporate overnight as their children become teenagers. So perhaps a way in is, how can we support these parents in their spirituality of parenting teenagers, and how we can help them support family life? Or maybe it's about supporting them as individuals on their own journey. Either or both. And then another aspect of Messy Church discipleship that we think needs more work is something around what and how people learn, either with their heads or with their hearts, in this dimension of formal learning. There are a variety of ways that Messy Churches teach about worship and prayer, for example, and those are on the screen. And these are the categories that we put to leaders in our survey work and their responses. So 65% say they model intergenerational worship, 59% teach about worship, etc. But do we know enough about how these are working? Whether they're working well? 2 focus group participants were reflecting on the take-home resources that they give to families. One said, I've never had any feedback on whether it's used. And another replied, we're the same, and we hadn't even thought to ask for feedback. So I wonder what would happen if we found a way to ask people, gently, sensitively, adults, children, teenagers, what are you learning through Messy Church, and how did you learn it? Wouldn't that lead to a meaningful conversation? Wouldn't it be insightful and energizing for you as leaders and the team to reflect together on what people are telling you and use that to inform further planning moving forward? Here's another image from our Tenders Research Day. A lady in her middle years. She created this in the time we had together, and then she told us in an interview afterwards. My picture is based on the salvation grace kind of thing. So you've got sort of sin there, Christ's blood, your growth as a Christian, then you sort of move on into baptism, then Jesus is like at the top of it all, and we're sort of the people working through. And it was this participant who shared with us the quote that we included in the Playfully Serious booklet. When you do Messy Church, it's like totally different from the rest of the services in church. It just sort of gives that, yeah, I do need to grow. I've got a whole life to live feeling. So over to you now, with your neighbours. I wonder, what is the next step for your messy church, your messy churches, those that you help to support? What is the next step for you in developing discipleship? And I know you're all pragmatists at heart, so you'll probably think of all the ifs and the buts and the hurdles and the obstacles, but I would encourage you in this safe space, try and think round the obstacles or through the obstacles, just dream dreams. Dive in. I've stopped you because I want to leave enough time to talk about church and how Messy Church is maturing as church. Just before we do that, I have another image to show you. Again, as I said, we let the research participants choose their own made-up names, as we called them with the kids. So a boy, age 8, Tumbleweed. He created this and said, "It's a stable where Jesus lives, and that's me there." That figure in front. And you have to slump down. Doesn't it make you want to ask him some further questions? So, maturity as church, what is working? This slide isn't actually about maturity as such, but it's important to note that in the UK, in the British Isles, Messy Church appears to be a model that can happen in any social or geographic area. Our sample was deliberately spread across the following rural-urban categories and across the deprivation categories that are on the screen. And those of you who like statistics and read through our statistical report called Painting with Numbers will know, or you'll see, it's littered with the phrase, "These findings show there is no significant statistical difference across geographic or economic context." I also mention in passing that the median size of the Messy Church congregations in our sample was 43 people. This compares favourably with the median size of Church of England, Anglican congregations in England, which is 35, or at least it was in 2017. I wonder how this compares with your own denomination's average size of congregation. So, back to Messy Church maturing as church and what's working. I think there's a sense that teams are finding patterns of gathering that are working for them and their families and having the confidence in those decisions. Some of the previous Messy Church literature invites, or rather fresh expressions of church literature commentating on Messy Church, invites Messy Churches to consider meeting weekly. Enough said. It would be lovely, wouldn't it be lovely? But we have to be realistic too. And on the screen, there's a bar graph that shows of our sample, 67% met monthly, 24% met 4 to 6 times a year, a few met more often than monthly, brave, and a few met less than 4 to 6 times a year. But some of our attenders, on our attenders research days, they actually described monthly as frequent for them and family life, and how much they valued quality of gathering over quantity of gathering. But that doesn't mean there isn't connection between your main gatherings, and some examples surfaced across our research that included prayer request email groups, social media chat groups, meal rotas for families in tough times, or babysitting rotas, social activities, outings, picnics, cinema trips, sleepovers in the church, and Christian conferences, New Wine, Soul Survivor, I could go on. And 19% of all the messy churches we spoke to reported further outreach activities, which is one small indicator of self-reproducing dynamics, one of the three selves often used to measure church maturity: self-financing, self-governing, self-reproducing. So self-reproducing. So it wasn't only that they were doing mission through messy church, that their messy church was saying, how can we do further mission? And given that in many cases messy churches have started with nothing, little or no budget, no full-time leader, no dedicated building for your exclusive use, your main gathering is either monthly or 4 to 6 times a year, we were really quite intrigued at the sense that you were building something from nothing to some degree and seeing this ongoing momentum. What about word and sacrament? Those two words get used a lot in our denomination. I don't know about yours. Well, with the caveats mentioned before about not knowing how well people are learning, here's what leaders said when we asked the question, how does your messy church engage with the Bible? So storytelling, 96%, some sort of creative activity or resource, 95%. 70% of the messy churches said they did a talk, 32% do a take-home activity for families, etc. The values, the model of messy church mean that exploring the Bible is a natural part of what is done. And as one focus group leader put it, attenders kind of accept that you're going to talk about the Bible in the celebration time. And what of sacraments? Baptism, confirmation, Holy Communion. Well, in our sample of 174, 107 didn't engage with sacraments. 107 didn't engage with sacraments. But here are the combinations of those that did. So 3 of the messy churches in our sample did all 3. 18 only had done baptism. 13 had only done confirmation. 18 only communion. And then 5 had done both baptism and confirmation. 1 was doing confirmation and communion, and 9 baptism and communion. Hope that makes sense. Good. So perhaps all we can say is that a start has been made, and we notice more messy churches engaging with the sacraments in this research than our previous research, which was called Day of Small Things. Some of you might have heard of it, which is really encouraging. We know preparation is important for introducing sacraments, and we're not saying do all of these tomorrow, but we're saying this might well be an area of growth that some messy churches might like to explore more with your permission givers. I hope you can see this. It's not very clear, but this was created by an adult and her daughter. Together they made this. And the adult said she'd never really come to church before, Messy Church, and didn't know much about following Jesus. But she'd started coming to Messy Church because of someone on the team that she knew. So she and her daughter created this picture. There's the table with the food and the folks at the top, and they labelled these people up for me because they wanted me to know how important they were to them, but I've covered them over just for anonymity. And the cross. And at the bottom, one big happy family. And then in interview afterwards, the mum told us, the team are all really lovely. Messy Church is my calm place, even when it's crazy. She said, I feel safe. So a bit of a shorter section there, because unfortunately I've got more to say about the challenges around becoming church. But just for now, turn to your neighbours and share, where do you see your messy church? Messy church is growing in maturity as church. And I know that some of you may not see your messy churches as fresh expressions of church, the worshipping congregations in their own right. You may be doing your messy church in a context where it really does work to feed people into existing church. So if that's you, please do still engage with the question, with the material, and reflect on how that process of feeding people into church is working well. Let me tell you about the craft on the screen. We had a family of 4 come along, a mother, a father, and 2 adopted children. And the mother and one of the children made this creation. And the mother told us afterwards in an interview, "My craft is a basic standard picture of a family with a love heart. And to me, it resembles my childhood. I grew up in a very religious family, 5 days a week at church, too much. I'm here at Messy Church for my children. I'm determined not to have it pushed down their throats. But this drip feeds a little bit about Jesus' life and the Bible on a level for them, because I don't want them to have what I had. Day to day, Messy Church helps us be a bit kinder as a family, be a bit more loving as a family." And the father told us, "They've stopped doing a lot of Christianity in schools, haven't they? I mean, we all used to go to assembly and sit and sing hymns and stuff like that. And you always remembered the hymns, and they don't seem to do that as much now. And they've turned nativity into a comedy, and so now you have a lot of schools who do that. Or they don't do them at all." So in this strand, maturing as church, what needs more work? Well, it became evident in our research that we're not always sure what congregational maturity and congregational vulnerability actually means in practice. In our focus groups, insightful questions and issues were raised, such as, well, perhaps maturity means moving on from being fresh. Or perhaps it means keeping the freshness. Is it about the whole team maturing or the whole community maturing? Is it about messy church becoming like existing forms of church? No. Or is it mutual support and learning across congregations within a parish or circuit? We know it's about discipleship, but what else? And I suspect that we, and by that I mean researchers and fresh expressions of church commentators, are probably to blame for this, because it is us who talk easily about ecclesial, and by that I mean church maturity, or ecclesial church vulnerability, as if they are terms used regularly in the course of daily church life. And of course they're not. When did you last hear the terms used, vulnerability, maturity, in the context of an existing congregation? These terms, maturity and vulnerability, are part of the vocabulary used by church planters. And it's this planting instinct that is at the heart of fresh expressions of church. Whether it turns out to be a new congregation you're planting within an existing area, parish, circuit, or it turns out to be maybe more of a formal church you're planting in areas where church has died out. I wonder, I don't know if you've been asked this question before, maybe you have, how many of you are energized, liberated by the thought that in beginning your messy church, you were or you are actually a church planter, or perhaps a less intimidating term, a congregation planter in all but name? Anyone care to show a hand? Are you energized by that? Thank you. Fantastic. How many of you are absolutely terrified at the thought that you might be a church planter? Is this a safe space? Yeah. And how many of you are somewhere in between? You're not quite sure where you think, and you think what you think, and might be somewhere in the middle. Thank you. So I wonder, what would it look like if we drew on the wisdom that we've learned in the last 40 years about church planting and planting congregations in the UK, in the British Isles, in our mainline denominations? What do they have to teach us about maturity and what protects against vulnerability? One thing we think would help is some light touch strategic planning. And before this begins to sound dull or onerous, let me ask you, I'm sure you've been asked this before, how many of you have had to adjust your messy church plans for unpredictable numbers? Make a shepherd's pie stretch from 15 to 30 at a moment's notice? Magic up an extra craft table from nowhere out of bits and pieces from the back of the cupboard? Change a prayer activity because 75 people have turned up, and if you all take turns to stick on a plaster on the big cross to symbolise saying sorry and being forgiven, you won't get home till next Tuesday? How many of you have had to adapt your plans to suit inflexible buildings or spaces? Schedule around half terms and school holidays, so school semesters, vacations? Work on a shoestring budget or fundraise? Coordinate volunteers who are busy, sometimes painfully shy, and have small children themselves that they're trying to juggle at the same time? So you guys already have considerable skills at strategic planning, both ahead of time and in the moment. So I wonder, what would it look like if you applied these skills looking forward to developing more congregational maturity? What if you identified one goal, just one goal for the coming year? And I realise many of you are in oversight positions, so what have you encouraged your messy churches to identify one goal for the coming year? For example, do you need to pray and plan for new leaders? Do you need to pray and plan for someone with evangelistic gifts to join the team? Do you need to plan for connecting with new people again through schools, through local under 5s work if your original cohort has grown up? Do you want to plan for more pastoral care in messy church families through home visits, maybe one visit a month? Do you want to plan for a stronger sense of congregational community, maybe through the socials I mentioned earlier? What is the next stage for you? And I want to say something about leadership succession, by which I mean identifying who will take on the role of leader when you reach the point when you need to step down. This issue was most often cited as a vulnerability of messy church. One or two gifted, enthusiastic leaders step down and the messy church stops because there's no one else to lead. The wisdom from church planting is that leadership succession has to be planned for, and that you, in consultation with your permission givers, but you should take responsibility for praying and planning for who can take over, and mentoring that person or those people into that role. Over my years at Church Army, I've been with them almost 20 years now, I've occasionally seen some evangelists not hand their work on to new leaders because they actually want everything to stop when they move on. They want to look good, they want to look competent and needed, they want to be given a job. And I do sympathise a little because we all want to be appreciated. But if we are to develop messy churches as church, we need to be bigger than that and make sure we put things in place for our messy churches to grow from strength to strength beyond and after our leadership. There are other aspects to maturity you could work on. Do you have the right representation on decision-making councils of the church? In my denomination, that means, do you have formal representation on the PCC? Do you include your messy church as an important feature of wider church life when your parish or circuit or network has a vacancy for a minister, for a vicar role, the overseer role? Do you actually put it in your parish profile? Does your messy church have its own section in your AGM, your annual general meeting reporting or equivalent? Does your church website list your messy church under its worshipping congregations drop-down menu or its activities and events drop-down menu? And when your messy church team of volunteers seem to shrink, or someone's ill, or someone's away, do you give a rushed notice on a Sunday morning for a few extra pairs of hands? Or do you ask the person leading the intercessions to pray for the team leading messy church that God would draw to it the right leaders for the life of this congregation? Pastoral care, building that stronger sense of community. I suspect you're already very good at this. You know everyone's names, you notice when people aren't there, you ask after them. I'm sure you pray for families and individuals privately or as a team. You try to help when babies are born, when someone's ill, when marriage breakup occurs. I was really surprised by the adults in our attenders church, those adults who hadn't had a connection with church before coming to Messy Church. How easily they talked about bereavement, death, serious illness when we asked them about what had taken them deeper in their faith. And it wasn't always the vicar that had had those conversations with them. So I wonder what would happen if a few more of us went on pastoral care training, that sort of thing, so that we're ready and we're confident and we know we can help them when help is needed. Another aspect that needs work around Messy Church, maturing as church, is to do with busyness, our busyness as leaders. It was identified as the biggest hurdle to developing discipleship in Messy Church. At the top there, 60% of Messy Churches talked about the team being too busy. Some of this busyness seems just to come from the demands of everyday life and leading Messy Church as a spare time volunteer. One focus group participant said there's a lot and we're all quite busy, and in a sense it's quite draining on the leadership team. Not to say it isn't rewarding as well, but I really don't want to do too much more. But sometimes there was a sense that leaders are being stretched across too many roles within parish life. Even when you lead a messy church, people at your Sunday church, or your sort of existing traditional Sunday morning church, still expect you to clean the pavilion, do the readings on Sunday, lead the intercessions. When I, as a messy church, or this person who was speaking said, I haven't even had the time to be able to go and visit all my messy church families. So I wonder, what would it look like if some of us took courage in both hands and announced we were only doing messy church? If we said we didn't want to be on the flower rota or organising the summer fair or typing up the parish magazine each week? I wonder what it would feel like. Those outside Messy Church can be cynical that Messy Church doesn't take families on a deeper journey of faith. But is that fair if they're not releasing or enabling Messy Church leaders to have the time to have a go at doing this? And perhaps this is the point to say there are some people, traditional Christians, who will never get Messy Church, never understand what it's about. Either they're too old, too uncomfortable around creativity or the arts, or just too adult-focused to explore what spirituality looks like in children or family life. Don't wait until everyone at the Sunday morning existing congregation gets it, or everyone on your parish council gets it. Make sure the right one or two people have some idea, those individuals you are responsible to, and trust yourself in making decisions about what will help you lead Messy Church most effectively. Evidence is your best conversation to effectively challenge and change culture, modelling it for them to help them understand it better. And then I think there's something around looking after ourselves in leadership. On one level, people may say, oh, surely leading a messy church is easy if you're good at organising, chatting to a few parents at the school gate, in the community, thinking of crafts. But some leaders talked of the more subtle demands that perhaps others don't see on the surface, engaging so far back with people in terms of how little they know about the Christian faith, how to nurture faith in both children and adults together, with a team who score around 5, 6, 7, 8 out of 10 for finding it a natural thing to share their faith. We have wobbles. We live with the unknown and have to trust, as the quote says on the screen, that whatever situation we're in with the people who have come through the door, you're trusting God for guiding you to provide what is needed, and then trusting Him to actually carry that work on. We sense that it can sometimes be lonely. And it reminded us of a poem called I Stand at the Door by Reverend Samuel Shoemaker. He wrote this: "You can go in too deeply into church and stay in too long and forget the people outside the door. The most tremendous thing in the world is for people to find that door, the door to God." But he goes on to say, there are some people who don't understand or appreciate what you're doing by the metaphorical door and don't support you in that. He wrote, "I admire the people who go all the way into church, but I wish they would not forget how it was before they got in. Then they would be able to help the people who have not even found the door. As for me, I shall take my old accustomed place near enough to God to hear Him and know He is there, but not so far from people as to not hear them, and remember they are there too. Where? Outside the door. 1 of them, 2 of them, 10 of them, whose hands I am intended to put on the latch. So I shall stay by the door and wait for those who seek it." Those of you who have most responsibility in leading messy churches, do you have space to breathe, time to reflect, to retreat, to hear from God? Has anyone offered you a spiritual director or a coach or just someone who could be a listening ear to help you reflect? I know these things can sound quite grand. Should I, can I, little old me, ask for this kind of support? I suspect if you've been leading a messy church for a year, you may not think you do, but if you've been leading for 5 years or more, you'll probably jump at the chance for something that will feed your soul and re-energize you. You may have this already, but I just pose the question. And how are you enabling this for your volunteers? The last image, we had a mother and daughter come on the day, and they created this together. The mother said, "We painted a tree. This represents our messy church. We thought about a sort of flourishing, growing messy church, and we talked about the branches together, reaching out into the community. The people on their journeys, isn't it? We talked about growth and journeying with Jesus and continuing that journey. That was the leaves, wasn't it?" And then her 11-year-old daughter said, "Yes, and the blossom is that they have a deep relationship with Jesus." I thought I had plenty to say and that I would be able to finish early. I don't. We've taken longer, so I'm going to, with your permission, hopefully, skip over the next discussion question, which is about what is your next step in seeing your messy churches grow in maturity, and perhaps take that on in your free time, your bar time, your meal times. Keep talking about that, because I want to finish with this. You'll see on the screen what we call the leadership donut. This is on page 9 of your booklet. This shows you at first glance the leaders involved in messy church. So on the outside we've got gender, then working in we've got whether they're a fresh expression of church or more outreach. I can go through all of those different categories in the session after coffee. But what I want you to notice right now is that all the red are female leaders. And I want to read you a poem that our team came across, and you'll see why. I've put the leadership donut up when I start reading the poem. We think, sadly, in our denomination, much of our female leadership, especially our volunteer leadership, goes unnoticed. And to the gentlemen in this room, thank you for all you do in Messy Church. Your contribution is just as important, if not more so, to challenge the stereotype. And I hope there are ways that this poem speaks to you too. It's by a lady called Mandy Smith, over in the States. She writes this. You have been told your body is shameful, too ordinary, too messy. But there is one who says you are lovely, because you are made by him and he delights in you. You have been told your gifts are unnecessary, too ordinary, too messy. But there is one who gave you those gifts and he calls you to use them. He delights in you. You have been told your voice is unimportant, too ordinary, too messy. But there is one who gave you your voice, and he calls you to use it. He delights in you. You have been told your calling is a lie. You are too ordinary, too messy to be used by him. But there is one who calls you. Stand up and let him use you. Ordinary and messy as you are, let him speak through you, through every story, every tear, every song. He delights in you, and he wants to show his delight through you. You will find all of our statistics and our focus group analysis and so much more here on our website, churcharmy.org/playfully serious. All free to access and download. And I brought as many booklets as I could manage to bring on the train. I've got 100 of them at the bookstall, free for you to take and distribute. And this afternoon, my workshop, we have 12 spaces. It's a first come, first serve. Please sign up. I'll be inviting this small group that we'll have together to spend some time preparing our own way of describing discipleship to our attenders. I suggest a creative way, using art, because that's what many of us are familiar with, Messy Church, and I think there is something about symbol that helps people kind of get to the deeper stuff. But if you would like to spend some time reflecting on how you would describe discipleship to your attenders, adults and children, come along to that. We'll have a go at preparing, and then we'll be brave and share this with one another and get some feedback. Thank you very much for listening. Enjoy your coffee.